dangerous as a barbarian king and as complex as the forest itself. The springtime woods resounded as he battled other Leshia with screeching winds and roiling floodwaters. In the fall, before retreating underground to sleep out the winter, he was again filled with fury, and the forest beasts fled before his wrath. In the summer, though, his temperament was sportive. By rearranging signposts, by taking the shape of a friendly traveller, generous with advice on shortcuts, or simply by calling out in the plaintive tones of a lost child, the Leshy could lure a wayfarer farther and farther from the path until he found himself in a fetid swamp or at the dizzy edge of a precipice. As likely or not, the Leshy's gleeful laughter would then ring out from among the forest shadows. There were dog tales, too, of women who followed a woeful call that led them into birch copses, where they were attacked by goatish Leshia. Travellers were tickled to death by the fairy, who bedevilled their sides with twigs and teased their faces with forest grasses until they shrieked with laughter and gasped their last. Those who hoped to thrive in the forest were well advised to mollify the fairy lords with offerings. Herdsmen slaughtered cows and left the carcasses for the Leshia before driving their cattle to woodland meadows. Hunters set out bread and salt, the one symbolising life, the other, because of its preservative properties, eternity, as hopeful tokens of lasting friendship. The Russian Leshia accounted for only a small fraction of the teeming fairy population that haunted the wilds then. As the noble Tuatha de Danann retreated into the mists, reappearing only occasionally, and in diminished form, the ancient powers of the nature fairies endured. In that era, when trade was fitful and towns a rarity, most of European civilization consisted of scattered villages, girdled by pastures and by fields of oats and millet and barley. The lives of the peasants were ordered by the rhythms of nature, the spring growth, summer ripening, and autumn bounty that brought sustenance, and the harsh and hungry days of winter. Their existences were bounded as well by the tracts of forest or heath that encircled each hamlet. Throughout the natural world, mysterious powers were at play. The ordered patchwork of fields and groves were quickened by forces that ripened the grain and protected the harvest, or allowed it to fall victim to blight or thieves or crows. Misty shrank to the height of the stubble. Nonetheless, shirkers who napped amid the grain knew him well, for in the afternoons he roamed the fields on a pony that kicked the sleepers and showered them with clods. In Germany, spirits called Kornbucker not only guarded the grain, but also caused it to ripen. As elusive as the Bolevik, they rode the breezes that rippled the wheat fields, hid stock still among the stalks in the guise of blue cornflowers, or prowled the fields as ill-tempered goats. It is not always clear whether these fairies acted out of concern for the interests of the peasants, or simply to protect the fields and groves that were their home. The fairies of English hazel thickets, so familiar that they were known by such homely names as Churn-milk Peg and Melchdick, were said to inflict painful bloat and cramps on anyone who tore off unripe nuts. They were probably angered more by the damage done to the trees than by the theft. Still, a story of one domesticated orchard elf leaves little doubt that these spirits of nature, some just which of the trees that marked boundaries, overhung village wells or shaded churchyards, might be haunted, but it was wise to show particular respect toward any tree that age, disease or storm had twisted or blasted. Such trees were the most likely to harbour spirits. Certain kinds of trees, too, commonly partook of the supernatural. English oaks, found in copses where saplings had grown from the roots of felled trees, were homes for oakmen, dwarfish creatures unfriendly to intruders. The presence of bluebells in these copses was a sign that oakmen were present and that mortals should walk warily. The elder tree housed a guardian spirit known in England and Denmark by the same name, Elder Mother. She was so protective of her tree's well-being that prudent villagers never failed to ask the fairies' permission before picking elderberries. It was thought best, when clearing a field, to leave the elders standing and plough awkward detours around them. Whoever felled an elder tree risked, at the least, seeing his livestock carried off by sickness. The price could be higher, however. It could be much higher, as a Derbyshire farm family discovered. Every midsummer eve, even in his old age, the father of this family had climbed the hill behind his cottage to lay primroses at the foot of 3 elders that crowned the hill. On his deathbed, he entreated his 3 sons to continue this ritual, but 2 of the sons were made of different stuff and scorned to show respect to trees, fairies or no. Only the youngest continued the custom. Such devotion rankled the older brothers. Eventually, one of them seized an axe and set off up the hill to put an end to this folly. When he returned, his clothes were flecked with fragrant green wood, and his face was ashen. He could not speak of what he had seen or felt as his axe bit into the very wood. For days he withered on his pallet. Finally he died. By then the second brother had felled another tree, and his end was the same. Only the youngest brother and a lone tree remained, and all his life, and during the lives of his children as well, primroses graced the fairy tree each year at Midsummer Eve. The kinship of such spirit life to the primeval wilderness is clearer in the light of certain tales travellers told of forest trees ensouled by fairies. The trees were similar in character to village trees, but immensely more potent, for the ancient powers of fairy lingered long and strong in places unconquered by humanity. Willows growing in the forest, it was said, sometimes followed wanderers, muttering threats as they creaked and shuffled malevolently along the forest floor. On the moors of Somerset, a female spirit, called the One with the White Hand, flickered from birch copses as pale and gaunt in the trees to ambush young travellers. If she brushed a youth's head with her spidery hand, he would go mad. If she touched his breast, he would fall dead. Such were the risks of wandering far from the relative security of the villages. Even the ordinary rigours of travel were daunting in those days. A journey to another village could take many hours or several days under the best conditions, and travellers rarely met the best conditions. Most often they encountered mud, swollen streams and matted undergrowth. Even when the path was open and the season favourable, misfortune could strike. Waiting in vain for an overdue wayfarer, fellow villagers could only speculate. these fairies roamed the mountains of Wales, caring for goats, whose beards they combed each Wednesday, the day said to be the fairies' Sunday. They sometimes took the form of goats themselves, but more generally appeared as old women, and they disliked mortals. A Welshman of undoubted veracity, in his neighbour's estimation, was toiling up a mountainside one night, when he discerned in the gloom the bent figure of a crone, her ash-coloured garments barely distinguishable from the bracken. She trudged slowly along the stony path, and it seemed a simple matter to catch up with her. But though he quickened his steps, he drew no closer, and although he hailed her, she would not turn around. Puzzled and annoyed, he hurried toward the ever-receding figure. He soon forgot himself and the purpose of his journey, and everything else except the drab figure ahead. Only when the ground beneath his feet grew soggy did he stop, realizing that in his single-minded pursuit he had strayed far from his path and blundered into a swamp. Just then a crackle of ancient laughter rang out through the marshland vapours, and the man knew that a Gwyllion had tracked him. Remembering that fairies often feared iron, he drew his knife, and the laughter stopped. He was alone and hopelessly lost in the dark. There was nothing for it but to wait until the night in that forsaken swamp. The story recurs with countless variations in travellers' tales from those days. It is often difficult to tell whether the spirits of forest and mountain spun their deceptions in order to discourage mortal trespassing, or simply to amuse themselves. But their playful natures always clouded when mortals despoiled their domain. Even at that early date, when game was plentiful, mortal lords laid claim to hunting preserves. Every beast within the boundaries of such a preserve was reserved for the lord's pleasure. Peasants who filched a hare from the meadows or a fat pike from the streams risked punishment. The same held true in the wider wilderness ruled by fairies. Its stags, boars, bears, and even the tiniest of its furred and feathered denizens were the jealously guarded property of a fairy master, to dispose of as he pleased. In Russia once, travellers reported a mysterious migration of squirrels that turned the forest floor into a squirming, leaping carpet of fur. According to those who knew the forest, the explanation was simple. Last year were notorious gamblers. One had had a run of bad luck and was paying off a neighbouring lessee escaped for the moment, his impulsive nature was his undoing in the end. On the trek back, he thoughtlessly shot a final hare. Before the year was out, he sickened and died, and no one doubted that the brown man of the moors had wasted his strapping frame. In spite of such hazards, humankind could not turn away from the wilderness altogether. Its game, berries, and mushrooms were welcome additions to villagers' dull daily fare, and it yielded wood, peasants' cottages, and to fire village smithies. In the summer, herdsmen drove their cattle into the forest to forage for sweet grasses, and in the autumn swineherds followed with their pigs to fatten them on acorns. And there was the sheer extent of the wilderness, the fact that any interchange between neighbouring settlements and the human appetite for news was sharp, had to be conducted through a barrier of forest. Offerings of food and drink went far toward mollifying the patron spirits of the wild, as did a respectful demeanour. When passing through a leshy's domain, for instance, a wanderer was well advised not to whistle or shout, and one sure way to isolate him from his own kind. No less perilous to susceptible young men were the golden-haired Vile of Central Europe. These mistresses of the forest spoke the language of animals, tended herds of chamois and deer, and were enchantingly beautiful. Their bodies were as slim and pliant as the stems of young pines. Their eyes flashed like a dapple of forest sunshine, and their songs rose in a golden thread of melody above the rustle of foliage. A man who glimpsed Avila was doomed. He would yearn for her so desperately that he would become a stranger to all who knew him, and in the end he would die. The most dangerous among the nature fairies were the spirits of streams, ponds and lakes. The Vodyanoi of Russia, green-haired and as bloated as drowned men, lived near watermills and afflicted nocturnal intruders with water sickness, dropsy, so that their bodies filled like sponges with liquid. The Scandinavian neck sometimes sat serenely on the glassy surface of a lake or river, a red cap covering his sunny ringlets, and played a golden harp. He required a human sacrifice each year, and his shriek of "cross over" echoed eerily on riverbanks, following any drowning. In the mournful northern waters of Scotland lived the malign Kelpie, who sometimes took the form of a handsome grey horse that could be seen galloping along the stony banks of a loch. All such horses were not suspect, of course. A crofter, watching from a nearby hill, would breathe easier if he saw a lone grey horse trot up to a groom he knew, or docilely submit to a rider. But if the beast veered out into the lake, its hooves striking foam across the choppy surface of the water and clearing the ripples as if they were solid ground, the watcher would hurry off to warn his family that the feared waterhorse was abroad. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, but we will rejoin this chapter in another video. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers saying I shall see you very, very soon. Bye bye for now. Bye bye. Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I'm going to do some reading from this lovely vintage book. It's from the Enchanted World series, and this book is called Magical Justice. So, let's take a look inside. So we've got contents page. Chapter 1 is called The Code. Chapter 2, Fortune's Wheel. Chapter 3 is The Mediators. So let's begin with Chapter 1, The Code. There was a time when only a thin skin, unseen and frangible, separated the human realm from the abyss of evil. The pit where monsters lurked and demons cavorted was so close at hand that ordinary mortals could sometimes glimpse its shadows and inhale generously recompensed. Peasants were showered with treasure, or elevated from a hovel to a palace. Marriage to a royal spouse was frequently part of the prize. For the wicked, however, penalties were harsh, ranging from public humiliation to agonizing death. Chilling though these tales of retribution might be, they provided their own consolation, for within their ambit, cruelty was always punished, and tyrants were never let off scot-free. If such justice could not be guaranteed in the mundane world, it was at least a certainty in the enchanted one. In the old world that gave birth to old law and legend, no mortal, from the lowliest roadside beggar to the emperor in his marble palace, was exempt from the obligation to do good and act kindly. But a monarch was born to be a model to his subjects, a living textbook of all the virtues. The very fabric of the universe was threatened when kings and queens abused their powers. Yet, being human as well as high-born, they often did, and the chronicles of early ages recounted many well-deserved downfalls and comeuppances of those who wore a crown. In the long halls of the Norse earls, poets regularly entertained feasters with the salutary tale of the undoing of Frodi, a king who ruled in Denmark in the days when the Vikings were known and feared from Ireland to Byzantium. He had, in the springtime of his reign, been a lucky ruler. His people prospered, their kine waxed fat, their fishing nets were heavy with herring, and, unusual for that turbulent age, they lived in peace. No invading armies menaced their borders, no alien galleys loomed out of the sea, no raiding parties captured their blue-eyed children to sell in distant slave markets. Indeed, Frodi's only sworn enemy was a king named Mysinga, who nursed a long-standing blood feud, the origins of which were not certain, but Mysinga's kingdom was far away from Denmark and much too poor to raise an army or a fleet. Yet Frodi did not share his subjects' contentment. A cankerworm of frustration gnawed at his vitals. Among his store of treasures was an object of inestimable value, a giant mill consisting of two vast grinding stones that was reputedly possessed of magic powers, but he could gain no profit or pleasure from it. Whether the millstones came to him as inheritance, gift, or spoil of battle was not recorded. According to rumour, they had been quarried in the other world and brought to this one on a wind conjured up by weather-working witches. Some claimed they were formed of the lava that poured down the slopes of grim Mount Hecla, the northern gate of hell. Whatever the truth, they were no ordinary quernstones. Instead of turning wheat or barley into meal, they were said to be capable of grinding out silver, gold, love, happiness, or anything their miller asked of them. But the stones were so heavy that neither Frodi nor the burliest of his earls was strong enough to turn the massive mill, so the device stood idle in Frodi's castle, accumulating dust and legends. Once Frodi made a voyage across the cold waters of the Skagerrak to pay a state visit to his cousin, the King of Sweden. Some of the Swedish lords' followers had lately gone fulsome speech of gratitude. Then he announced with a fine semblance of regret that affairs of state forced him to cut short his visit. That night the giantesses named Menia and Fenia were bundled into Frodi's own dragon-prowed longship, and the convoy sailed. When they landed in Denmark, Frodi led the slaves directly to the massive millstones. Without letting them rest from their journey, or offering them so much as a morsel of barley bread to eat, he ordered them to start grinding. Well schooled in obedience, the women began without complaint, just as Frodi had hoped. They were able to do what no one else in his court had done. Sweating and straining, they grasped the stones, pressed their considerable weight against them, and soon they succeeded in turning the enormous rollers. To Frodi's delight, out came all manner of good things for himself and his people: peace, prosperity, fine weather, and wealth in endless supply. The more the giantesses produced, the more Frodi wanted. For months he neglected all affairs of state. No edicts were issued by his scribes, no wrongdoers were dragged before him for judgment. All his attention was directed to the delectable dilemma of what to ask the mill for next. Singing rhythmic chants to spur them in their labours, Menia and Fenia ground without stopping. The sweat poured out of them, almost flooding the chamber. They begged the king to let them pause, but Frodi refused and ordered them to keep working. His voice cracked like a whip across their shoulders. Slaves, he reminded them, lived only to do a master's bidding. He would have them turn the mill as long as it pleased him. Menia and Fenia may have been giantesses. They may have been more than human, but they were not made of iron. Their massive hands were bleeding and blistered, their necks stiff, their backs nearly broken. They asked again to be allowed a respite. Frodi smiled and said they might stop their labours when the birds stopped singing. But it was the season of nearly endless daylight, the northern summer, and the bird song never ended. Once more they begged for a rest. Perhaps because they had been born and bred to slavery, Menia and Fenia were incapable of outright rebellion. The life and wealth of all the realms in the Northlands depended on the docility of a vast brigade of slaves and bondmen who stoked the fires, toiled in the fields, spun the yarn and nursed the children. The notion that slaves might defy orders had no means of forming in minds that had been shaped for only one thing: submission. And the two giantesses were no exception, but anger was not beyond them. The witch light flickered in their eyes as the same thought came to them at once. If their master wanted them to grind, then grind they must, but they would grind what they pleased. The heavy quern turned slowly, and the ponderous millstones grated against one another, but no longer did they turn out gold and worldly goods. Now Menia and Fenia milled horrors, poverty, pestilence, misery, weapons, war, grief, and famine. The two giantesses ground out the plagues that killed sheep and cattle, illnesses that laid low men, violent quarrels that ended with the flash of a knife and a geyser of blood. Drafts from the quern cracked the skin of the Danish earth, floods covered it, fires glowed dully where barns and houses burned of their own accord, and the keening of mourners at 1,000 funerals ululated throughout the land. When the king cried out to his two slave women to stop, the rumble and thunder of their milling drowned out his commands. They were not disobedient. stony, infertile fields and their profitless fishing, and stirred them to battle. Bards, at the king's behest, spoke the words of the saga that had preserved of all time the old hates between Frodi's and Mysinga's clans. Then they sang the songs that conjured bloodlust. Hands that had only known the plough or tiller itched for the sword, the spear, and the skull-cleaving axe. Speeded on by favourable winds that the giantesses ground out, the fleet came in good time to Frodi's shore. Under cover of a dense night fog, also the work of the angry millers, the enemy army landed and swooped in a sneak attack. Many Danes were slaughtered in their beds, many fell fighting. The few survivors were chained up and taken away to be sold as slaves. Frodi himself was struck down by the hand of Mysinga and died an agonizing death with the sign of the blood eagle hewn out of his back. While Mysinga's men ransacked the coastal villages, the victorious king entered the castle where Mania and Fania still strained and laboured. The tellers of the tale did not explain how he knew them to be the authoresses of his triumph. Perhaps he saw the shadows of a flashing battle axe or a burning village. Emerging from the mill, he announced himself as their new master and commanded them to cease milling. Beaming, they stopped their toil and showered him with thanks. Here was a merciful owner who knew that even slaves needed rest. Mysinga questioned them at length about the powers of the magic mill. Then he bade them roll their great stones to the sturdiest ship in his fleet. Mania and Fania were not allowed to enjoy their leisure for long. Once the galleys put out to sea again, Mysinga decided that he too would use the mill to gain his heart's desire. He was not a wicked king. His first thought was of his country's welfare, and the greatest woe in his land was the lack of salt. Without salt, food gathered in the warm months could not be preserved of the winter. As a result, many families died of starvation. So he ordered Mania and Fania to set to work again, there on the high seas. Blessing this new master, who had freed them from the impossible demands of Frodi, the giantesses returned to work with a will. Yet soon they grew tired and asked Mysinga to let them rest. The king berated them. Had they any idea of the privations caused by the absence of salt? Did they know what it meant to see good fish and flesh rot because there was no way to preserve it? Had they any notion of how his people suffered? Mania and Fania shrugged and turned again to their labour. If their new owner wanted salt, then salt he would get. The mill moved under their powerful hands, and the slaves began to grind with an uncanny speed. Within moments, out came enough salt to preserve all the herrings caught in a year, enough salt to pickle all the rabbit and venison and pig meat on the land, enough salt to weigh down Mysinga's flagship, break its timbers, and sink it in the cold grey depths. Without a word of rebellion, Mania and Fania followed their new lord's orders, and in doing so sent him down to lie forever on the ocean bed, where his bones turned pearly and his head was crowned with seaweed. When the galley sank, so did Mania and Fania, still rotating the mill as the waves closed over their heads. They did what slaves were meant to do. They would work until their master ordered them to stop. But Mysinga was far beyond speaking, and the order never came. The Norse bards said It was how the waters of all the seas became salt. So in this picture we can see Mania and Vania continuing to work underwater. Even when the millstone sank to the bottom of the sea, endlessly turning, they ground out the salt that filled the world's oceans. So this is another story, a harsh payment in kind. In the wilderness of Scandinavia lived peoples divided from their neighbours by mountains, forests, and deep fjords. This was a land abounding in shape-shifting phantoms, and ordinary folk kept themselves to themselves, knowing it was best not to put too much trust in appearances. Once, the populace of an entire kingdom learned this hard lesson through the sufferings of their young queen. The lady had been taken from her real parents in infancy and raised by a foster mother whose ways and doings were secretive and strange. They lived on the shores of a cold inland sea, in a windowless house with stairways that led nowhere and sinuous corridors with no end. The old woman sang softly as she did her tasks, whispering into the wind, tracing runic symbols on the empty air, sculpting wax images and flinging them into the tall, tiled stove. Sometimes she vanished for long periods, inexplicably. The child dwelled placidly inside a thicket of rules and restrictions. Certain rooms were out of bounds, certain words were forbidden. But as she grew up, she began to chafe against these prohibitions. One day, her foster mother announced that she was going on a long journey. As always, she forbade the girl to open the 3 doors on the top story. But this time, the fosterling rebelled. She began to wonder what secrets her guardian wished to keep from her. She paced back and forth before the doors 100 times, then impulsively opened one. With a rush of wind and a flash of light, a shooting star escaped, skittered down the twisting corridor and vanished into the night. Terrified, the girl banged the door shut. Bent double with cramps, she awaited her guardian's return. Once home, the foster mother knew without asking what had happened. She made the girl's ears ring with a severe scolding. When the time came for another journey, she raised an admonitory finger and said only, "Once warned." Alone again, the girl decided that a scolding was a small price to pay for satisfying her curiosity. When she opened the second door, a great white moon rolled out, then melted into the empty air. When the foster mother returned, her asked her to be his queen. King though he might have been, his wooing was like any other man's. It was not the manner of their marriage, but its outcome that made the tale so remarkable. The monarch's mother was appalled by the match, and hinted that the maid had something sinister about her. When the royal couple's first child was born, the Queen Mother's suspicions seemed to be confirmed, for on its first day of life, the baby disappeared. The only trace was a blood stain on the young Queen's mouth, a sure sign of sorcery. It was well known that witches craved the flesh of human infants. The Queen, unable to speak in her own defence, could tell no one what had happened. The King refused to believe that his wife had eaten their firstborn, and insisted that it had been stolen by some enemy of the crown. When a second child was awaited, he ordered dozens of guards to patrol the palace, to watch over the newborn heir. After she gave birth, the Queen heard a strange, high-pitched chanting echo through the palace, saw her attendants fall into a stupor, then lost consciousness herself. Once again, the dawn revealed the mother's empty arms and bloody mouth. The King insisted that so beautiful a face could never conceal a witch's heart. If there were evil magic about, it had been perpetrated by other hands. When the Queen was brought to bed a third time, the King ordered the infant's cradle to be wrapped in chains of iron, a metal abhorrent to races not quite human. Again, precautions were useless. The guards slept, and the chains were soundlessly severed, but the Queen remained awake, bound by a spell that left her helpless. Only her eyes moved, following the progress of a hooded shape through the barricaded door and across the chamber. It was her foster mother. The old woman pricked the baby's finger and smeared its mother's mouth with blood. "Fair payment," she said, "for the 3 treasures you took from me." Then she vanished with the infant. The Queen knew the King would no longer be able to protect her. This time the Queen Mother's accusations were heeded, and the King had to sign the death warrant. A pyre was made ready in the marketplace, and the Queen tied to a stake. But before the faggots could be lit, princesses all, it seemed, by their dress. They inclined their graceful necks when they saw the traveller, and out of gleaming eyes gave him a clear, severe, wild look that made his heart contract with longing. In and out of the mist, the strangers wound, now visible, now not, of the earth and yet not of it. They moved in a nimbus of brightness, and behind them a road leading back into the forest offered a vista of a mighty fortress, also bathed in lambent light. The traveller never afterward could tell how long he stood transfixed, gazing at the shining company. Its riders pranced before him neither a long time nor a short one. The patterns of their time were alien to the stolid march of human hours and nights and days, just as the rhymes of their music were strange to the beats of the human heart. At last the traveller later said he could no longer see the riders, and he heard only an echo of a melody he never could quite recall. The gilded light and the many towered palaces in the distance were gone. He spurred his horse and trotted to the forest's edge, where he found not a blade of grass disturbed or flattened. There was no sign of the riders, or of the land that had appeared behind the trees. Although the traveller waited and listened, he saw and heard no more, only the impatient whickering of his horse. At last he went about his business, but the rest of his life was illuminated by that one moment. When he was old, he forgot much, as old men do, but that one night he never would forget. Nodding by his fireside, he told the tale again and again. He told his son and his son's son, and each time, in the telling, even when he was frail and aged, the radiance of his youth passed once more across his face and kindled his old eyes, and his listeners envied him the moonlit meadow and the night journey. Of what the traveller had been privileged to witness, there could be no doubt. He had beheld a fairy host riding in procession. He had been given a glimpse of a race of beings, human in form, and more than human in power, that once thronged the fringes of the mortal world, and he was among the last of mortals to see such a sight, which is why his fellows envied him. In the traveller's time, the fairies had begun to retreat from humankind. His was an era when fields were claimed from the green forests that mantled the globe, sometimes splendid and sometimes grotesque, but if they desired, fairies could also assume the shapes of deer or falcons, flames or flowers or jewels. At times, they cloaked themselves in invisibility. Although they lived on a plane that was linked to the physical world that humans knew, their realm was endowed with additional dimensions. Their kingdoms appeared and disappeared between one blink of the eye and the next, in a way that could only disturb humans. It was as if a full, complex and inexplicable life went busily on, unseen among the mortals' precariously maintained civilizations. Fairies naturally inspired speculation. Ever curious, ever eager to name and define, mortals recorded their glimpses of them in songs and tales and poems. Naming came first, for the name of a thing was charged, as it is in some ways even now, with the essence of that thing. To know a name gave the knower some measure of control over the thing it named. Like all else about fairies, the sources of their names were ambiguous. The words for fairy in Spain and in Italy were fada and fata, respectively, and these seem to have been derived from the Latin fatum or fate. In recognition of the skill fairies had in predicting and even controlling human destiny. In France, however, the similar word fée came from the Latin fatal, via the Old French faire, meaning to enchant. Fée referred to the fairy's ability to alter the world that humans saw, to cast a spell over human vision. From fée came not only fée, but the English word fairy, which encompassed both the art of enchantment and the whole realm in which fairies had their being. Fairy and fée are the derivatives of the parent word, referred only to the individual creatures. The other common English term for an individual fairy was elf, and this derived not from Latin, but from the Nordic and Teutonic languages, reaching England with invasions from the continent. In Scandinavia, the word for elves was alfar, which, appropriately, since fairies were tied to the things of the earth, had to do with mountains and water. Mortals used these various terms interchangeably to describe a broad range of elusive beings. Mindful of the fairies' nature, they most often referred to the race as a whole by epithets, the gentry or the good people, or the mother's blessing, and the like. In those days, using a creature's true name without permission implied a threat, unwise in the case of fairies, whose reactions were unpredictable and whose powers were great. For the purpose of classification, however, the entire race could be roughly divided into a peasantry and an aristocracy. The peasants were solitary fairies, descendants of the spirits who at the beginning of time ensouled all nature. They were guardians of tree and field, of forest pool and mountain stream, although they shared in some powers of fairy, such as the ability to become invisible or to appear in various shapes. Solitary fairies were wild creatures, and their meetings with mortals were relatively rare compared with those of their grand relatives. The presence of a solitary fairy was most often announced, not by a direct sighting, but by evidence of the creature's activity, the bending of grass as a fairy passed invisibly over it, vast seas. To mortals, they were objects of infinite desire and sometimes infinite fear. The Alfar of Scandinavia were believed to be divided into good and bad branches. The Leosulfar, or light elves, who were earth dwellers, and the Dogalfar, or dark elves, whose kingdoms were beneath the ground. The Scots made the same distinction. Their fairy bands were called the Seelie, or Blessed, Court, and the Unseelie Court, the latter often being thought of as the vengeful ghosts of dead mortals. No such division was made in Wales or Ireland. There, the trooping fairies, companies like the one the traveller had seen in the meadows of Connaught, were taken as a whole in all their complex manifestations. In Wales they were called the Tailwaith Teg, the Fair Family. In Ireland they were known as the Dainside, the dwellers of the fairy mounds, for it was under those softly swelling grassy knolls that many of their palaces were hidden. Ireland, in fact, provides the most complete accounts of the trooping fairies and their kind. Irish tales and songs trace the history of these fairies back thousands of years, to a time before the boundaries between their world and the mortal one became dangerous to cross, before mortals grew to fear entrapment in the lands of the fairies, and before the love that could exist between mortal and fairy turned to hopeless yearning. At that time the island had not yet been completely formed and defined. Its hills and lakes and streams were still without names and identities, but mortals were present in number. According to the histories, Ireland had been settled by a people called the Firbolg, who were beginning to tame the rich wilderness. On the first day of May one year, the sky to the north of the island was darkened by a cloud that spread across the rolling hills and blotted out the sun. It gathered around the peaks of the mountain of Conmany Rain, in the very heart of Ireland, and hung in the air for 3 days. When the mist thinned and drifted out to sea, troops of glittering warriors wound in columns down the mountain, drove away the people of the Firbolg, and took the island for themselves. The fairy warriors had come from enchanted islands at the top of the world, travelling to this green and pleasant land in the dark cloud that had settled around Conmany Rain. They were called by humans Tuatha De Danann, which meant the people of the goddess Danu, a fertility goddess. The title may have come to them because of their elfin power over the growth of crops. They were farmed, in the words of an early scribe, as the most handsome and delightful company, the fairest of form, the most distinguished in their equipment and apparel, and their skill in music and playing, the most gifted in mind and temperament that ever came to Ireland. Their power was great, for they possessed magic talismans, a spear and sword no enemy could survive, and a cauldron that was never empty of food. How long the Tuatha reigned nobody knows, but sometime in an antiquity older than the granite of the Irish mountains, they were conquered, despite their talismans, by new and mortal invaders, ancestors of the Gaels, who were to rule the island. The Tuatha took refuge in invisibility. Some built kingdoms within the hollow sea, of leaf and tree and field. The two races reached out to each other in defiance of their alien natures. Again and again, in the comradeship of arms or in the bright fires of love, the beings of fairy ventured into the mortal world. Again and again, mortals set out on journeys that carried them unknowing across the boundaries of fairy, and their adventures were curious indeed. Okay, this picture here is the High King of the 3+Hrs, heroic fairies of Ireland's distant past. He was the bearer of many titles and the source of many legends. He was styled the father of all, as well as Lord of Knowledge and son of all the sciences. His chief title, Dagda, meant the good God. For the sea-girt Irish, each ocean voyage was uncertain. The waters of the Irish Sea and the North Atlantic were speckled with strange and shifting islands, as the Irish Imrama voyage tales record. Adventurers told of sighting such islands as one of cat-headed men and another of men with dogs' heads, one with a fountain that yielded milk, ale and wine, one of giant horses, and one that turned everything cast on one side white and anything cast on the other black. It was hard to tell in those days whether a sea voyage would go on in a normal and eventful way, or whether the fierce wind and tides of the north would drive the little boats off course and across an invisible barrier into the realms of fairy, where adventures would begin as they did for a prince named Teague. His story was this. Teague was the heir of an early lord of Munster, in the west of Ireland, and he took to the sea on a voyage of rescue and revenge. A marauder named Cathman, with a fleet of 9 ships, had invaded Teague's lands, laid waste the fields, burned the villages and departed for his own stronghold, an island off the coast of Spain, taking as captives Teague's wife, Levan, and 2 of his brothers. Teague was left with 40 warriors, 1 captive from Cathman's band, and a fierce determination to deliver his family. He caused a curragh, a stout ship, to be built. It had strong masts and broad-bladed oars, and the frame was covered, the story says, with hard red leather made from the hides of 40 oxen. On a bitter morning in March, they launched the little ship at Kerry Head, sliding her over the pebbles of the shore and into the grip of cresting seas. With the oars flashing, the Irishmen drove forward into wind and icy rain, and it was not long before Teague and his 40 warriors and the captive enemy, whom they had taken along to guide them, were out of sight of the cliffs of Munster. They sailed for a month, seeing little on the limitless and rolling sea except the sleek brown heads of inquisitive seals and the flash of leaping fish. From time to time they heard the blowing of whales. Twice they put in at unnamed islands to rest and to reprovision. Then came a space of 6 weeks when they made no landfall at all and travelled in a cloud of mist that was broken only occasionally by streaks of pale and watery sunlight. The men grew hushed and drawn. The captive guide, chained in the bow, squinted anxiously ahead, but he had lost his bearings in the fog. At last he said hopelessly, "We are adrift, drifting across the sea, toward them like a falcon stooping on its prey. The sea swelled high above the masts in roaring mountains that smashed icy torrents across the bow. Gasping under the onslaught, the men pulled at their oars with cold, stiffened fingers. As Teague shouted encouragement, they brought the boat around into the wind and held her there safely throughout the day and the screaming night that followed. Morning came at last, and the gale died. The sun rose, scattering diamonds across the surface of the sea. The men raised the currag's sails and headed west, and the sun played on their backs as they rested. Soon they saw in the distance a coastline. They steered for it, and at length the curragh slid quietly into an estuary of green water, so clear that the voyagers could see the silvery sands of the bottom and watch the darting of the scarlet salmon that played there. The shore on either side was fringed with trees, and from their midst poured the carols of unknown birds. Teague and his men made for shore and together pulled the curragh up to dry on the shingle. Then they entered the wood. The travellers knew at once that this was no ordinary place. In Munster, spring had just begun. The earth was bare and hard there, and the trees were black. Here, however, the trees were thick with leaves and heavy with fruit. Their branches swayed gently, although no wind stirred, and they seemed to listen as the intruders passed beneath them. All were trees sacred to the Irish from ancient times, so revered that anyone who cut them might forfeit his life. Some were venerable and mighty oaks, worshipped since time began and sentient still. Oaks wailed when they were cut. Apple trees, fertile guardians of immortality, grew in abundance, laden with scarlet globes, and among them stood many hazel trees, heavy with the clusters of yellow nuts that in Ireland sometimes bestow all the world's wisdom on the mortal lucky enough to eat them. After the men had walked some little distance, the wood thinned and became sunny again and park-like. Then the travellers found themselves at the verge of the wood, looking into the country that it guarded. They laughed and exclaimed at the sight that met their eyes. Something out to the rim of the sky was a wide, smooth plain, cloaked in the green and white of flowering clover. Breaking the expanse were 3 grassy hills, each guarded by a high walled palace. The men set out for the nearest one. At its marble ramparts they met a blithe and shining lady. She seemed to expect the travellers and to trust them, for she called Teague by name and sent him with his men to the hill beyond, where the scene was repeated. The travellers came to the third of the hills, and, as they had been instructed, passed through the mighty arch gate of the castle there and entered the courtyard. At its centre grew a wide-spreading apple tree, its branches white with blossoms and also laden with fruit. From among the white blossom drifted a woman like a flower, her hair resembling silvered petals. She regarded the mortals with a calm gaze and said Teague's name. Care fell from him at the sound of her was this. She told Teague what the manner of his death would finally be, so he knew that the time for it had not yet come. She told him too that she herself would be with him on his last day on the banks of the Boyne River, when a wild hart would gore and kill him. After she had spoken, those two, the mortal and the fairy, smiled gravely at each other, for such was the 3+Hrs' power that she had armoured Teague against fear, although the men with him shuffled anxiously and whispered among themselves. But they followed Teague willingly when he left the court, and with the fairy beside him, crossed the flowering plain again and made his way through the enchanted wood to the Curragh. The water whispered around the ship's bow as it headed down the estuary. High above the masts, the 3 birds rode the bright air and sang without cease. On the bank stood the fairy, arrow straight and star bright. She neither moved nor spoke again, but she watched Teague steadily. When the Curragh reached open water and gathered speed, Teague turned to look a last time and thus saw the sheet of mist that rose from the water at the island shore and crept swiftly up the banks, curling around the trees and around the figure of the fairy, until at last it blanketed even the tops of the tallest oaks. The mist eventually dispersed into coiling white ribbons drifting on the water's surface. Then even these ribbons disappeared, and where the island had been was only empty sea, and the red-sided Curragh, her canvas billowing with fairy wind, sailed southward. Above her masts, the 3 birds flashed and tumbled and sang their dancing harmonies. In the boat, the men of Munster lay entranced. They awoke only when the singing ceased and the birds had become 3 bright specks in the northern sky, heading for home. At once, the Curragh grated on a beach, her sails slack. The travellers were at the edge of a narrow lock that pierced the shore of a harsh, pine-covered country. Across the waters of the loch were the ramparts of a wooden stronghold. From its tower hung the pennon of the pirate Cathman, abductor of Teague's wife and enslaver of his brothers. The Munster men had arrived at the place of battle. Leaving his company to guard the Curragh, Teague armed himself and set out to reconnoitre. As he walked along the sand, he heard his name called softly across the water. A ragged ferryman, pulling hard at the oars of a shabby boat, approached and beached his craft. It was Teague's brother, Owain, brought to this humble pass after a year of captivity under Cathman. Owain's news was good. Teague's wife was safe, but a prisoner, and Cathman meant soon to take her for his own, having been delayed only by her pleading. Teague had arrived in a time of conspiracy, for 2 of Cathman's kinsmen synthesis of the world of mortals, and thinks a fairy had a natural affinity for the indeterminate and the undefinable. To relax the mortal grasp of order was to invite passage between the two worlds. Okay, I am going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed that. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers saying, I shall see you very soon. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye. Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today we're going to take a look at this lovely Enchanted World book on water spirits. Now I've chosen a chapter for us to begin looking through, so let me get it for you. So, daring the sea god's realm. Let's begin. The oldest of all sea quests began 30 centuries ago, when the elder gods still ruled the world and had not yet retreated before the advancing tide of humankind. The adventurer was Jason, Prince of Iolcus on the northeast coast of Greece, who had spent his youth hidden in the groves of Mount Pelion, receiving tutelage from the centaur Chiron. Jason had been sent into Chiron's care because his murderous uncle, Peleus, had usurped his father's throne, and his parents feared for the boy's life. When he reached manhood, however, Jason came down from Chiron's mountain alone and challenged his uncle, demanding his rightful inheritance. This happened on the feast day of Poseidon, Lord of Horses, Earthshaker, god of the sea. Peleus, who claimed Poseidon for his father, could not desecrate the rites by murdering his nephew, but he was not inclined to give up the throne. He regarded Jason narrowly for some moments. Then he stated his terms for surrender of Iolcus. Bring to me the golden ram's fleece that hangs in the oak wood of the king of Colchis, he said. Journey there by sea. This was naming the impossible. Such a voyage would take Jason across the Aegean, where capricious gods and spirits ruled, and from there into unknown territories commanded by beings no one cared even to describe. Colchis itself was remote. It lay on the shores of the Black Sea, whose entrance was guarded by a magic that no mortal had ever defeated, and the Colchian king was unlikely to relinquish so venerable a treasure as a fleece of gold. It was for just such quests as this, however, that Jason had been bred and schooled. The centaur Chiron, half horse, half man, was a tutor of heroes, Hercules, of Tyrants and Achilles, and the master physician, Asclepius, had all spent their childhood in the dark and whispering pine forests of Chiron's mountain, learning from him the arts of Hercules slapped smartly against the stone mole that formed the harbour of Iolcus. The company of Jason assembled for the voyage. At the water's edge, leaning on tall leather shields, their oiled skin gleaming and their eyes narrowed in the bright light, were 50 of the finest warriors of Greece. Among them were Hercules of Tiryns, the strongest of men, wily Theseus of Athens, who in Crete had slain the Minotaur, Orpheus of Thrace, who could charm the very beasts of the field with the music of his lyre, Tiphys of Boeotian Siphae, the most skilled of helmsmen, Nauplius and Eurypmus of Dinarus, sons of Poseidon, and the Spartan warrior twins Castor and Polydeuces, keen-eyed Lynceus, who could see things hidden below the earth, Mopsus and Lapith, skilled in augury, and Acastus of Iolcus, Peleus' own son, who against his father's wishes had insisted on the venture. One woman was there, Atalanta of Calydon, fierce and long-legged, a famed runner and huntress. And the builder of Jason's ship was there, Argus of Thespiae. His name meant as the sun rose high, they rounded a headland and sped onto the lapis blue waters of the open Aegean. Pine-covered Skiathos fell to port. At their backs the wind picked up, and they shipped oars and stepped the mast, lifting the heavy timber from its resting place in the hull and setting it firmly into a cross plank amidships. They made the timber fast with stays, drawn fore and aft. They unfurled the broad linen sail from the yard arm. The sail belied and strained the sheets. Now the men rested on their benches. In the stern, his hand firm on the long steering oar, the helmsman, Typhus, stood guiding the Argo as she ran before the breeze. If wise eyes watched the sailors from the foam or from the sea's depths, there was no sign. They headed northeast across the Aegean, making for the Phrygian coast. There they would have to negotiate the narrow passage of the Hellespont and sail across the sea of Propontis. Then, if they could navigate the Bosporus and gain the inland sea, they had only to crawl along the north coast of Asia Minor to reach Colchis on its distant shore. The journey's beginning was marked by fair days and mild, when the wind blew steadily at the seafarers' backs, allowing them to rest and dream along the sun-sparked sea road. The broad expanse of the Aegean was strewn with mountain islands. One after another they appeared, first no more than a dark smudge on the horizon. Each took on vivid lines and hues as it drew near. Shimmering grey olive orchards appeared, set against the green of young crops. On rocky hillsides, sheep could be seen grazing. Then the details drifted back into blue haze, and another island rose above the horizon to beguile the eyes. Some days, however, the sailors had hard work. The ship's sail could be used only if the wind was abaft the beam. When the breeze shifted forward, the Argonauts unstepped the wooden mast, stowed it with its sail furled inside the Argos's hull, and bent to their oars. Orpheus took his stance in the bow, then and paced their strokes with his lyre. Whether by sail or oar, the Argonauts hugged coastlines where they could, or made short hops from island to island. They sailed by day and steered towards land each evening, scanning the shore for dark slashes that signalled the mouths of rivers. In the shelter of such backwaters, out of view of pirates and marauders, the men could beach the craft. Then they would hunt and fill their water jars, and finally settle by the Argo to sleep out the night under the wheeling stars. But landings such as these were only the kindest of the Argonauts' adventures. Their way was marked by perils. They had to slip through the Hellespont at night to avoid the soldiers of the King of Troy, who guarded the strait. On the island of Arctonussus, in the sea of Propontius, they battled 6 armed earth giants. Later, driven ashore by a gale, they were attacked by a troop of warriors, whom they slaughtered. In the morning, however, they discovered that the warriors served a petty king who had given the Argonauts shelter only a few nights earlier, and so was a hearth friend. sure of what is actually happening, awaiting Jason and the Argonauts at the gateway to the Black Sea were the rock giants, a pair of granitic monsters forming a maw that could crush any ship to splinters. They were in the passage now, and the blackened, rain-slick stone faces were rushing towards them. Timbers quaking, the Argo sprang forward, riding up and over the furious swell, while blinding mist boiled and writhed around the seafarers. With a terrible roar, the Symplegades smashed together, grinding and shrieking after their concussion. They missed their prey. The rocks had crushed the tip of the calf's stern. That was all. The Argonauts had gained the inland sea. Now the water was calm, and high above it a kingfisher soared, its wings like fire in the sunlight. Behind them all was still. The Symplegades had ceased to move. They were close together and skirted by ruffling foam. The Argonauts had done what no sailors had ever accomplished. Their feet fulfilled an ancient prophecy that the Symplegades would remain forever fixed in place if a mortal-built ship passed safely between them. But the passage had been accomplished only with divine help. The men later said that they had seen the giant figure of white-browed Athena rise from the waters as the huge wave grasped the ship. She had held the vessel, protected by the branch of her sacred oak, in the safety of her hand, and carried it past the danger. This was the exhilarating climax of the Argonauts' voyage. It was their single greatest triumph of seamanship, and the last achievement to be unspoiled by human treachery and strife. The Argonauts sailed on to Colchis, where Jason seduced the Colchian king's daughter, Medea. Skilled in witchcraft, she helped the Greeks obtain the fleece and fled her homeland with them. Perhaps because of this dishonour, the adventure disintegrated into tragedy and shame. As if the very seas were angry, contrary winds plagued the Greeks on their homeward voyage. In alien waters, some of the best and bravest perished. What happened when the Argo at last reached home is a matter of dispute. Some chroniclers said that Jason presented the golden fleece to his uncle and then, for reasons no one knew, sailed peacefully away. Some said that he murdered Pelias with the aid of Medea's magic and was driven from the sea by the king's outraged subjects. Most agreed that he eventually abandoned Medea and came to a shabby end in Corinth, old and alone, dreaming of the glories of his youth. It seemed that he was said that Ea stayed in the waters of the Persian Gulf at night, but came ashore by day to instruct humankind in cultivation, in letters, and in the mastery of astronomy. In Indian oceans dwelled the fish god Varuna, whose breath made the sailors wind. The seas of Japan were the home of kindly Compilation, patron god of seamen. Sailors wore his image close to their skin, and Japanese warships once cast coin-filled casks overboard when they passed Compilations's shrine at Kotohira. These offerings were picked up by fishermen and carried to the shrine so that Japan's nautical defences might remain strong. Sometimes the characters of sea deities were coloured by the natures of the oceans where they reigned. The cold and severe waters of the northern seas, for example, harboured the forbidding Scandinavian gods, Aegir and Ran. Soul eaters who collected the bodies of drowned mortals in their undersea kingdom. In contrast, the mercurial ways of the Greek sea gods reflected the caprice of the warm Aegean itself, now blue and jewelled, presenting a calm and loving face to the overarching heavens, now a storm-racked destroyer. The old gods who ruled these waters were as chaotic as creation itself. They had 1,000 names and more than 1,000 faces, but they themselves were as fluid in form and character as the watery element, and as old. The father of all living things, said the Greeks, was Oceanus, manifest as a great stream girdling the world. The mother was Tethys, his consort. From these two sprang the old men of the sea. Of them, the eldest was kindly Nereus, known in Jason's time by the appearances of his 50 lovely sea nymph daughters, the Nereids, who often were glimpsed playing among the waves, seashells agleam in their streaming hair. Another was Phorcys, father of sea monsters. Yet another of the old men was Proteus, who might be seen on rocky islands, shepherding herds of seals. Proteus was the most elusive of creatures, for his shape changed constantly. He might appear as a man, or a fish, or a flame upon the water, or only as spindrift hanging above the waves. The ruler of them all was the sea god Poseidon, son and conqueror of the most ancient race of gods, the Titans, brother to Zeus, lord of the air, and to Dis, the underworld king. Poseidon could gather clouds and wind, raise or quiet waves, allow safe voyages through his world or doom the sailor. He was the father of sea storms, lord of flood, sender of earthquakes. Mortals believed that his palace lay in a shimmering cave deep within the Gulf of Euboea, east of the Greek mainland. They said that he appeared on the waters in a chariot drawn by 100 horses, white beasts with golden manes and hooves of brass. Poseidon was as fertile as the waters he ruled. Hundreds of sea and island creatures were his children. Some were sea nymphs, fathered upon Nereids. One Odysseus set sail for home, commanding a convoy of 12 painted war galleys, not much different from Jason's Argo of a generation before. The journey should have been a relatively straightforward affair. It involved sailing from Troy on the coast of what is now Asia Minor, south through the Cyclades, around the tip of the Peloponnesus, and up the western coast of Greece to Ithaca. Such a trip would normally be completed in a few weeks. Because of Poseidon, it took Odysseus 10 years to reach home. Odysseus was aptly named. The word was Greek for victim of enmity, but he was no innocent victim of God or man. Although he had courage and cleverness in abundance, he was merciless and a prince of liars. His men were worse. The years of encampment and fighting on Troy's windy plain had coarsened their honour and hardened their hearts. Careless of their gods, the Greeks invited their own disasters. The sailors were still charged with battle, lust, when they left Troy. Instead of heading south, they steered north to the Thracian coast intent on piracy. They sacked the city of Ismaros and slew almost all of the inhabitants. After the attack, the pall of smoke hanging over the shattered city could be seen for miles inland. The Greeks left with all the treasure they could stow under their rowing benches, but these spoils would cost them dearly. Evidently, they had aroused some god's wrath, for no sooner had they made the open sea than a gale struck them. The ship's sails were shredded in the blasting wind, and the oars snapped. So ferocious was the storm that Odysseus and his men were blown far to the south into the cruel, uncharted seas that rimmed the world. Jason's course to Colchis can be followed on any map, but no chart showed the mist-shrouded realm where Odysseus wandered, a place where the oldest magics still lived and God's children still played. The seafarers might even then have gone home safely had not Odysseus struck against the sea god himself, leaving the larger part of his fleet in a safe haven. The warrior mounted a foray on Sicily, then a waste of tumbled rocks and meagre pasture inhabited by the one-eyed giant shepherds called Cyclops. Ever the rogue, Odysseus stole the sheep and goats of one of them and blinded the giant with a stake through its single eye. Then he fled with his companions, carrying the animals to the ship. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and I will return to this particular reading his antlered head brushed against the tree branches. When he called, the animals of the wood streamed into the clearing, clustering in the grass at his feet and bowing their heads to the ground. In the face of such power, Owain bowed too. Then he asked the god where he might find adventure, as if this were not adventure enough. The god's eyes crinkled with laughter at the man's presumption, but he spoke. He told Owain where he must ride, and what he would find there, and Owain left him. The knight followed a track through the forest to a sunny valley where a single tree towered, spreading enormous sheltering branches all around. In this tree's shade stood a stone fountain. On the fountain, fastened with a silver chain, a silver bowl lay. As the god had bidden him, Owain leaned from his horse, drew water from the fountain using the silver bowl, and then poured it out. Among the surrounding woods, thunder rolled, the sky darkened, the wind howled, and borne on its fury came a volley of hail, clattering against the shield Owain raised above his head, and bouncing thick and white as stars upon the grass. Man and horse braced silently in the gale and waited. The fury ended as suddenly as it had begun. All the leaves of the great tree had fallen. Above Owain's head, on the now bare branches, bright-coloured birds sang to greet the returning sun. Owain had no time to listen to their singing, however. A warrior rushed down from the forested slope of the valley. He was the guardian of the fountain, armed all in black, and mounted on a black charger. And his lance was at the ready, its tip levelled at Owain's heart. The young man had time only to swing his horse around and lower his own lance into position before his enemy was upon him. The force of the impact broke both warriors' spears and knocked the men to the ground. After a stunned moment, they rose and drew their swords. Back and forth under the bare branches of the tree they fought, wielding their broadswords with strong, skilled hands, grunting with each swing of the heavy blades and each impact of steel on shield leather or mail. The fight was slow and brutal, and after a while the warriors could hardly lift their arms. Owain was the victor in the end. He found an opening, and with a last mighty effort brought his blade down upon the Black Knight's helm. The metal cracked, scarlet blood spurted over it and mantled the knight's shoulders. With a cry, the man turned. He stumbled to his horse, and swaying in the saddle, fled. In the moments it took for Owain to mount, the Black Knight disappeared into the woods, fringing the valley. Owain continued in pursuit, however. His horse pounded through the woods and out the other side. Ahead, the black horse, with its broken rider, raced across long water meadows, sending up flocks of startled fowl, toward a walled and towered city that crowned a slope far in the distance. The city gates were open. The Black Knight, with Owain now close behind, made for them. The knight gained the outer gate mortices in both gates crashed to the ground. The spikes of the outer gates stabbed through his horse's back, and the animal crumpled, screaming. Owain rolled free. He was trapped in the narrow strip of land between the two sheer walls. On the far side of the inner gate, a road lined with houses and thronged with shouting people swept into the city. 100 hands reached up to ease the Black Knight from his horse. Owain leaned against the stones of the wall and stared through the bars. His gaze was returned from the other side. A woman stood within, a fair young maiden, robed in white. "It is you who wounded the Guardian," she said, in the softest of all voices. "I am the one," he replied. "If yon Black Knight is he, the people will turn on you in a moment. Take this ring now and hold it, so that the stone is turned into your hand. It will hide you from them. When they raise the gate, come to me where I stand on yonder horse block. Put your hand on my shoulder to tell me you are there, and I will lead you to refuge." "Lady, why should you do this?" "The slayer of the Guardian becomes the new Guardian," said the lady. "My task is to set you in the Black Knight's place as Lord of the Countess of the Fountain. I am Lund, the lady's servant." All happened as Lund had said. The mob turned towards the gate, where Owain stood beside the broken body of his horse. Screaming, they drew up the inner portcullis and surged into Owain's prison, but they could not see him. The ring protected him. He walked through the jostling throng to the horse block where Lund was. He put his hand lightly on her shoulder, showing not even a flicker of surprise. She stepped down and began to walk through the town. She led him into the courtyard of the palace that stood at the centre of the city and up the winding stair of a tower. The chamber where Owain sheltered was fit for a king, hung with scarlet and grey and ornamented with gold. Owain bathed in a tub of bronze beside a charcoal fire. Then Lund served him from dishes of silver. She left him, but she returned from time to time to tell him the import of the sounds he heard below, of the great wail that signified the death of the Guardian, of the formal lamentation that meant he had been laid on his bier and carried into the courtyard. From his chamber window, Owain watched the chanting priests, the lords and ladies still as statues on their horses, the trumpeters with their golden horns, and in the centre of the crowd, the bier, guarded at head and foot with flaming tapers. The candlelight shone on the hair of the woman who stood beside the bier, a white-faced golden woman whose wailing sounded high above the trumpet's call. "That is the Countess of the Fountain," said Lund at his elbow. "She whose lord you must be. I will take you to her when the time is right." For 2 days and nights. While the Black Knight's burial rites took place and the lady mourned, Owain waited in his chamber, served by Lund. On the 3rd day, Lund led him to her lady, but the Countess turned her head away and would not reach her hand to raise him from his knees. "This is the man that reft my lord's life from his body," she said. Owain glanced for direction at Lund. The maiden was unmoved by her mistress's words. "What harm is there in that?" memories of his own world, of Arthur the king, of Lancelot and Gawain, and his companions in arms, faded from his memory, but he was called to his own world again. A day came when Owain rode forth from the city in answer to the thunderclap that signalled intruders on the fountain ground. As his predecessor had, Owain galloped across the fields and through the forest into the valley where the fountain stood. A knight waited there for him. He unhorsed the man with ease, but this man was not alone. Within the precincts of the fountain was pitched a splendid camp, gay with silk and ablaze with banners. The wounded knight stumbled into this. Encampment, and his fellows immediately shouted challenges to the victor. So on the next day, Owain fought another of the company, defeating him, and the next day another, and the next another. But at last a man who seemed to be his equal faced him. These two struggled all through a day and into the night, when the torches were lighted. In the shadows, when both men staggered with exhaustion, Owain knocked his enemy's helm from his head, and saw in the torchlight the face of his cousin, Gawain of Orkney. Owain's sword dropped. He greeted his cousin and named Gawain the victor. Then the champions of the Round Table met again with joy. Together, led by King Arthur, they rode to the city of the Countess of the Fountain. Together they begged that Owain might leave her for only 3 months to visit his own country and his own people. voice trailed into silence. "I will meet them," Owain said, and when 2 men came to drag Lund from her prison, the knight was waiting. He sat astride his horse, his shield over his shoulder and his sword unsheathed. The men drew up. They challenged him. He answered in kind, and they attacked. Owain was weaker than he thought. After his long wandering, he was thrown from his saddle by the first blow of one warrior's lance, and the pair of them bore down on him as he clambered slowly to his feet. But just then, with a roar, the white lion leapt over Owain's head. To the 2 warriors. Its great weight dragged them to the ground. Its curving claws and fangs ripped into their throats. Within moments, the beast was feasting on their flesh, and its snowy coat was spattered with scarlet. It paid no further attention to Owain, nor to Lund, when Owain freed her. Then Owain and the servant of the Countess of the Fountain rode together to the lady. She welcomed him with joy and without reproach, for by rules no mortal understood, the thread of her life was entwined with his. They had some weeks together, and one day they stood beneath the tree that overspread the fountain. Owain guarded, and his lady told him thus: he could not stay in her world, for he was a mortal man, and would always be drawn to his own. "Then let us leave it," Owain said. "Your life is tied to mine now. Let another lady reign over the city. Let another man guard the fountain." The lady assented. She left her own world behind and rode away with Owain. It was said that she lived at Arthur's court for the rest of her life. What became of her country, the story does not tell. After the lady left it, a veil seemed to draw around the place. It was never seen again by mortal eyes, but it may be that it still thrives, sheltered from time and change. It may be that the fountain eternally flows, and a knight eternally guards it, serving a woman who rules a hidden land of fairy. The end. I hope you enjoyed that. This has been Kate, was sent up daily in a basket. If he suffered, he gave no sign of it. Lacking his lute, he sang. Deprived of his poetry books, he composed verses of his own. But his father was right in one respect. The tower was indeed haunted. It was well known that the demons, known as Jinn, loved abandoned buildings and lonely countryside. They might ride the winds to visit others of their kind in the farthest reaches of the earth, but they were loyal to the places they claimed as home. The Jinnai of this tower took a certain pride in his princely tenant, and boasted of Camaril Zaman's gifts and graces to other members of the unseen world. Another spirit, female of the species known as Ifrit, claimed she knew a mortal maiden who equalled and perhaps even surpassed Camaril Zaman in beauty. This prodigy was a Chinese princess named Badora, who, like Camaril Zaman himself, had incurred her father's displeasure by refusing to marry, and was now a prisoner in a disused wing of his imperial palace. For the sake of experiment, the two spirits decided to bring the mortals together and place them side by side, so their charms might be compared. The Jinn were masters of the air, adepts in the mysteries of rapid movement. The unaccountable miles between Camaril Zaman's home and China could be crossed in a single instant. In the depths of night, when their powers were strongest, the two spirits conveyed the Princess Rhodora, all unwitting and fast asleep, to the ruined tower where Prince Camaril Zaman lay. Each in turn was nudged awake by their invisible captors. Badora, roused first, gazed for a long time at the sleeping stranger, who looked so like her he might have been her twin. She reached out a finger to trace the curve of his cheek and the line of his lips, but before she could wake him by her touch, the Jinn conjured her back to sleep again. Camaril Zaman, when his time came, was enraptured by the lady beside him. He cried aloud that he had never had a dream as sweet as this before. Eager to take some token of his bliss back into the bleak world of his waking, he slipped a jewelled ring off the unknown lady's finger and exchanged it for one of his own. Then he was sent to sleep again, and Badora covertly carried back to China. The next morning, Badora and Camaril Zaman woke up in their separate places of confinement to find themselves alone. The prince called for the slave appointed to serve him in the tower and demanded to know who had brought the beautiful visitor to him, and where she now was. Bewildered, the slave denied all knowledge of the woman. He swore that he had been on guard by the door all night, and that no one had passed him. At this, Camaril Zaman flew into a rage. Seizing the trembling man by the hair, he threatened to kill him instantly if he did not tell the truth. Breaking free, the slave fled in terror to the king's palace to report this latest twist in the young prince's condition, and to stammer out to the ruler his fear that imprisonment had turned his master's mind. The king was deeply concerned at the news and hurried to the tower skills and scholarship had elevated him far beyond the rank he was born to. Sharing the milk of a single mother, he and Medora loved one another like brother and sister. In a secret interview with his patient, he looked carefully at the foreign ring on her finger. He recognised the symbols upon it, he said, as the insignia of a royal house in a kingdom far to the west. Promising Medora that all would be well, he left the palace, taking with him a miniature portrait of the princess. For months there was no word from him. Then Medora heard from her maiden that Marzawan had returned to the court. He brought with him a stranger clad in the gown of an astrologer. Here, announced Marzawan, was a wizard of the West, steeped in the occult wisdom of India and Egypt. He and he alone held the secret for curing Medora. When the magician entered the princess's chamber, she cried out, for this was the youth she had met in her dreams. He, like Medora, had been deemed insane. When Marzawan arrived with Medora's portrait, the prince was restored to his senses. He had commanded the doctor to take him to the lady at once. The reunited lovers were sequestered for many hours. What questions, endearments, bows and caresses passed between them, the chroniclers did not reveal, but the couple emerged together to bow before the king and ask that he fulfill his promise and marry Medora to the man who had healed her. The wedding was hasty, the king only too glad to see his difficult daughter depart on the journey to her spouse's homeland. The nights of the honeymoon were passed in a silken tent, pitched in flower meadows, or on palm-fringed shores. The newlyweds did not speed their journey, choosing instead to prolong its pleasures. One morning, encamped in a wilderness, halfway between their two countries, Camaralzaman kneeled beside Medora, caressing her as she slept. As his hand strayed among her silken garments, he encountered something he had never noticed before, an amulet of chalcedony, carved with occult symbols. Curious, he unpicked the knotted cord that held the talisman and carried the gem out of the tent so that he might examine it more closely in the light of day. What happened next was so extraordinary that it must have been a new intervention by the jinn who had first brought the lovers together. A bird, and no ordinary bird, for its eyes glowed red like beacons, swooped and snatched the amulet from Camaralzaman's grasp. The bridegroom did not know the object's significance, but he imagined it was precious to his Medora announced herself as a prince from China. The Sultan of the island pressed his hospitality upon this distinguished traveller. So charmed was he by the decorous manner of this youth, and so impressed by his royal pedigree, that he offered his only daughter's hand in marriage. No boat was expected to sail to China for a year or more. Bedora, who had quickly grown into a friendship with the maiden in question, calculated the risks and probabilities, then squared her shoulders and accepted the proposal. On the wedding night, Bedora's secret could not be kept for long, but, as she had hoped, the bride's reaction was not dismay, but gales of laughter, and a promise of complicity in sustaining the deception. Absorbed in the pleasures of one another's company, Bedora and the princess hardly noticed the passage of time. When the next boat, laden with ebony, set sail for China, Bedora was not aboard. The Sultan had chosen to retire from the throne to a life of meditation and prayer. Following ancient custom, he conferred the crown upon his daughter's spouse. Bedora proved to be a wise and kindly ruler, and found that she liked the taste of power. There was little incentive to go back to China and live out a drab existence in her father's court as the abandoned wife of Camaralzaman. One morning, a merchant called at Bedora's palace with a gift for the new sultan and his queen, a jar full of ripe golden olives from a village on the mainland, famed far and wide for the succulence of its crop. Bedora dipped her hand into the vessel to sample the delicacies. She frowned and dug deeper, then pulled out a small, hard object that had been concealed among the fruit. It was stained and slippery with the oily juice of crushed olives, but she recognised it at once. It was the talisman that had vanished with Camaralzaman on their honeymoon. Bounding from her throne, she grabbed the merchant by the collar and shook him. She demanded to know the olive's source. He named the village, and she struck him once. He named the grove where the olives were picked, and she slapped him a second time. He named the gardener, who had handed over the jar, and she let him go. She commanded the trader to sail again to the olive grove. The gardener was a thief, perhaps even a murderer. He was to be captured and brought to her. Before the week was out, the ship returned. Bedora had prepared a dungeon filled with implements of torture, so that she might interrogate the prisoner and learn the fate of Camaralzaman. But when her intended victim was dragged before her, she let out a cry of amazement and ordered the captive's release. Camaralzaman stood before her, his skin tanned by the sun, his hands hardened by toil, but otherwise unchanged. Bedora sent everyone from the chamber and revealed to Camaralzaman that she too was not what she seemed. It took many hours before Camaralzaman finished his account of his own trials and travels. If he had not before suspected the hand of some Jinnai or demon in his relations with Bedora, he was now convinced of it. The events that took him away from her, and those that brought them back together, not only strained all credibility, success, sick with despair. When the sailors came back and put him in chains, he offered no resistance. He did not ask why they had apprehended him, nor did he care. Life had lost its meaning until this present moment when, against all probability, he found himself standing before his beloved once again. But Aura, accustomed by the duties of kingship to swift decisions, proposed a course of action. She was overjoyed to see her husband, but she had no desire to leave the Isle of Ebony or its queen. There was, she said, no law in this country against a man having more than one wife. If Camaralzaman would take the Queen of Ebony as his second spouse, Badora would doff her masculine disguise, and the trio could rule the isle together. Badora had no doubt that they would do so in peace and harmony. As she proposed, so it was done. No celebration in the island's annals equalled in grandeur the wedding and Camaralzaman's coronation, neither in the length of the procession nor the size of the sacred